Tu Diep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. Betrayal never comes from a stranger, it comes from those we trusted, those who stood beside us with a smile while hiding a knife behind their back. Tu Diep was hurt, not just by what happened, but by who caused it. Will Tu Diep let anger turn into hatred, or will she find the strength to forgive? Not because Trang deserves it, but because she deserves peace sometimes. Forgiveness isn't a gift to the other person. It's a gift we give ourselves to finally let go. The rain fell heavily that evening, turning the streets into rivers of reflection, of headlights, of regrets, and of truths that could no longer hide. Inside the small wooden house in the countryside, Tu Diep stood by the window, holding the cup of ginger tea James had made for her. The warm scent did little to ease the chill growing in her chest. She had just opened a letter that shattered everything. It wasn't from James. It was from Trang. "I'm sorry, Tu Diep. I never meant for it to go this far. I only wanted to be close to James. I thought, if you were gone, he would see me." The confession was clear. Trang, the soft-spoken secretary Tu Diep once called a friend, had been the one pulling strings in the shadows, the phone calls, the photos leaked to the press, the lie that made Tu Diep appear like a manipulative gold digger. It had all been her, not strangers, not enemies, but someone within James's circle. Tu Diep remembered the day she first met Trang. She had arrived at James's office, still smelling of rice field and sunshine, awkward in her flower-printed dress. Trang had smiled and offered her tea, showing her the way. There was no sign of cruelty in her then, just a polite, professional woman, loyal to her boss. But now everything changed. The kindness, the gestures, the accidental stories that reached the media, they had all been calculated. Tu Diep placed the letter on the table, her hands trembling. "She wanted to replace me," she whispered. James looked up from the sofa where he was working late, sensing something had shifted. "What is it?" he asked gently. Tu Diep handed him the letter, her eyes not leaving the rain outside. As he read, his jaw tightened. "She was supposed to be loyal," he muttered. "She's worked beside me for 5 years." Tu Diep said nothing. She felt numb, like her heart had gone into hiding. A few days later, at James's request, Trang was called in. She entered the countryside house, dressed modestly, eyes red. She didn't try to deny it. She had nothing left to hide. "I loved you," Trang said to James, voice low. "I watched you fall for her, and I couldn't stand it." She had nothing. She sold vegetables, walked barefoot, didn't even know how to use a laptop. And yet, you looked at her like she was everything. James didn't flinch, because she is. Trang turned to Tu Diep, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I was blinded. I thought if you left, if the world saw you as wrong for him, maybe I'd get a chance." Tu Diep remained still. No anger, no shouting, just quiet devastation. "You hurt me," she said, voice trembling. "Not with what you did, but with who you were when you did it. You smiled at me. You helped me pick a dress for his birthday. You sat beside me and asked about my mother. How could you do all that and still want me gone?" Trang broke down then. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. "I lost myself," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Later that night, James sat beside Tu Diep under the veranda. The rain had stopped. and the smell of the earth after a storm surrounded them. I fired her, he said. She's gone, and I'll make sure she never comes near us again. But Tu Diep shook her head slowly. No, she said, don't punish her for loving someone too deeply. James turned to her, surprised. You're forgiving her? Tu Diep's eyes were full of something that wasn't weakness, but wisdom. She fell in love with you, she said. And love, when it's not returned, can turn poisonous. I don't excuse her actions, but I understand where it came from. She looked into James's eyes. You gave her hope just by being kind. That wasn't your fault, but it was her choice to let hope become hatred. Tu Diep never invited Trang back. They never became friends again. But she didn't carry the hatred in her heart, because she knew that holding onto anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. Forgiveness for her was a choice to be free. James, watching the woman beside him, realized once more why he had chosen her. Not for her beauty, not for her innocence, but for her heart, strong enough to survive betrayal, and soft enough to forgive it. And somewhere far away, under a city sky, Trang stood alone by the river, holding a photo of the three of them, now faded and blurred by time. She had lost the man she loved, but in losing him, perhaps she would finally find herself again. Weeks passed, and the wounds Trang left behind began to scab over. Tu Diep no longer flinched at the sound of her name. James focused on rebuilding his company's public image, and the two of them began planting vegetables again in the small garden behind their countryside. Home life was slower, softer, but the air still held the scent of something unfinished. One morning, while picking eggplants under the sunlight, Tu Diep paused. A letter, neatly folded, sealed with no return address, and left at their gate. She opened it, her hands smudged with soil. Tu Diep, I have left the city. I am not asking for forgiveness again, but I am going back to where I came from, to face the people I hurt before you. You were not the first I envied. If I can't become better, then at least let me be honest. Thank you for not hating me when you had every reason to, Trang. Tu Diep folded the letter, eyes lingering on the words. Her fingers brushed the edge like touching a scar, no longer painful, but never forgotten. Trang stepped off the bus in a small district she hadn't returned to in over 10 years. The neighborhood was run down, nothing like the high-rise buildings she had gotten used to here. Everyone knew everyone. Here, people remembered. She had once betrayed her childhood friend Lynn out of jealousy over a scholarship, lied, turned her back, left. Now, she was back to apologize. Trang's journey of redemption wasn't about seeking forgiveness from Tu Diep or James anymore. It was about facing every version of herself she had run from. And that began here, not in an office, not behind a desk, but in the place where she first learned to envy. That evening, James sat on the steps of their house, his arm around Tu Diep's shoulder as she told him about the letter. She's gone to face her past, Tu Diep said quietly. James nodded. I've been thinking about the past too, he said. About my father and what he did to John's family, the secrets that led to all this. Tu Diep leaned into him, silent. I always thought being a CEO meant being strong, ruthless even. But now I see it's not about crushing people. It's about protecting the truth, even when it hurts. Tu Diep turned to him, her voice soft but sure. Then let's protect it together, He kissed her forehead, always. In the months that followed, Tu Diep's small vegetable stall grew into a full organic brand. Supported quietly by James's company, she became more than just the CEO's love. She was now a name respected on her own merit. Their love deepened, not through grand gestures, but through shared burdens and forgiveness. Trang never returned, but one day a package arrived. Inside, a small music box, hand-carved, simple. When opened, it played a lullaby Tu Diep had once hummed. While cleaning vegetables, something Trang had remembered. There was no note, only music and silence. But sometimes silence says more than words ever can. Final lines: we do not choose how others hurt us, but we choose how we respond. And sometimes, forgiveness is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a better one. Life often places us in situations where trust is tested, hearts are wounded, and truth is hidden behind shadows. In the story of Tu Diep, CEO James, and Secretary Trang, we witness a painful betrayal unfold, not at the hands of a stranger, but by someone once considered a friend. And yet, within this heartbreak lies one of life's most valuable lessons. Forgiveness is not weakness, and truth always finds its way to the light. Tu Diep's world was shaken when she discovered that Trang, the secretary she once trusted, was the one who plotted against her. Trang's actions were driven by envy and the secret desire to replace Tu Diep in James's heart. It was a betrayal that cut deep, not only because of what was done, but because of who did it. Pain caused by someone close always leaves the deepest scars. Most people would have responded with anger, revenge, or even hatred. But Tu Diep chose another path. She chose silence over shouting. She chose patience over punishment, and in doing so, she gave space for the truth to speak louder than any accusation. Trang, after being exposed, could have denied everything. She could have continued her lies or run away from the consequences. But instead, she admitted her faults and stepped away, not asking for forgiveness, but accepting that she had caused real harm. This act of humility showed that even the most broken people can find a moment of clarity, and that redemption begins with honesty. James, too, had to face hard truths. As a powerful CEO, he could have used his position to protect Tu Diep by destroying Trang's career, but he didn't, because he understood that justice isn't about revenge, it's about choosing what is right, even when it's not easy. This story reminds us of an important truth. Betrayal may break us, but how we respond defines us. Tu Diep didn't forgive quickly. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not pretending everything is fine. It is choosing to move forward without allowing bitterness to control our lives. It is the quiet strength to say, "I was hurt, but I will not let this hurt destroy me." Forgiveness also does not mean trusting again immediately, but it creates room for healing. And healing is what allowed Tu Diep to continue living with peace, not resentment. The final lesson is perhaps the hardest of all. People make terrible choices, and sometimes they hurt us not because we deserve pain, but because they are lost in their own wounds. Trang was one of those people, and while she could not undo her betrayal, she took responsibility, and that was a step toward redemption.